Welcome to Keeping Track of a Rapidly Changing World on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. This episode is called Japan's Doomed Plans to Invade and Occupy Hawaii. What did they hope to achieve? Our co-host for the show is Shackley Raffetto, a Captain U.S. Navy retired, former Chief Judge of the Second Circuit of Hawaii. Our guest for the show is Capt Lilly, Captain U.S. Navy retired, former Attorney General of the state of Hawaii. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. We should examine Japan's plans to invade and occupy Hawaii in 1941 as a precautionary tale of what could happen in a world where sovereignty means so much less than before. So let me start with you, Shackley. We have said that this is Japan's greatest blunder of World War II when it attacked Pearl Harbor, and perhaps the worst strategic mistake in history. Why do you say that?
It inspired America to bring all of its economic resources together to join in the war, which it had been dancing around, trying to avoid getting into another European war. And when Japan attacked the U.S., there was really no getting around it at that point. And it was a single hit. So we gave us a little bit of time to gather our strength, and fortunately the carriers weren't hit. They were out at sea at the time, and so just a few months later at the Battle of Midway, we began to turn things around, which was pretty quick. And then we brought all of our economic might online. One question I have, which maybe Mike can answer, is Japan didn't. They decided just to make the attack. They apparently had thought about trying to invade at least Oahu, and then decided against it. And I was thinking about it, and I was wondering if the reason for that, or one of the reasons, was their experience with the Russo-Japanese War, where they engaged in a great Navy battle in the Battle of Tsushima Straits and destroyed the Russian Navy, and that ended the Russo-Japanese War successfully for them. And I wonder if some of the people were thinking about that, and that might be the attack on Pearl Harbor might be a sequel.
Japan had its sights on invading and occupying Hawaii as far back as the 1870s. And it was major strategic thinking all through the late 1890s and into the early 20th century. And even the architect of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, in 1928, had told in a lecture to the Japanese torpedo school that, quote, in operations against America, we must take positive actions such as an invasion of Hawaii, end quote. In 1941, early 1941, Japan, the leaders of the military asked Yamamoto that they wanted to go to war with the United States, and Yamamoto was against it because he'd spent time in America. And he knew the industrial might of America, and he thought that there's no way that they can survive a battle or war with the United States. But if we're going to do it, if we're going to go to war, then he said we have to attack Pearl Harbor, and that was what they had planned for all through 41. And Yamamoto's major architect for that was a Commander Genda. And Genda came back to Yamamoto and said, well, if we're going to attack Pearl Harbor, we have to also invade and occupy. We got to push America back to the West Coast. We've got to invade and occupy. And there were discussions about that all through 41. And then in September, the Japanese had war games of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And at the end of that war game, Yamamoto said, okay, we're not going to invade. Our goal here is to knock out the Pacific Fleet. And that's all we want to do. And that should give us a breathing room, maybe a year, if we're lucky, 2 years, before we're going to have to really fight the United States. So that's what happened. And so then Pearl Harbor happened, and as Jay was talking about earlier, there's no question that that was the greatest strategic military mistake in the annals of history. Um, but then what was the failure to invade another strategic blunder? Should they have gone ahead and invaded? And it's interesting that what I found out when I was doing my research, that 2 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto changed his mind and realized that we should have gone ahead and invaded Hawaii. And so then he told Gendo, okay, work up plans for the invasion of Pearl Harbor. I mean, the invasion of Hawaii, and Midway became the opening gambit of that particular the next stage of attacking and invading Hawaii. But it had been Japan's goals early on. And I'm talking 1800s, all through the 1800s, Japan had its highlight. It was highlighting Hawaii for invasion. They felt that it's interesting. You know, we talk about the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was conventional wisdom said that Japan was really only looking to the Western Pacific, and that the co-prosperity sphere was just in the Western Pacific. But that's not the case. I have a map, 1943, a Japanese map of the islands, and it's in kanji, but it states in there that Hawaii was part of the co-prosperity sphere. They looked at Hawaii as part of Asia, as actually part of Japan. An author in 1942 in a book said that the Pacific Ocean is the Furosato, the native place of Japanese people. You have to think that Japan was looking at Hawaii as part of Japan. We had 160,000 ethnic Japanese living in Hawaii. It was the largest ethnic group in the islands in 1941. Imagine that. And Japan felt that they were part of the overall empire of Japan. These people that were living, these Japanese that were living on Oahu, they thought that if they invaded, that the local population, the Japanese, would rally to the cause of the empire. And I said, based on my experience and knowledge and my family and people in Hawaii, I don't think that's the case. The Japanese in Hawaii were very much pro-America. They were loyal, and so I think that was a misplaced guidance on the part of Japan. But another professor also claimed that the Pacific Islands, a Japanese professor, were extensions of Japan. So just imagine, Japan has always looked at Hawaii as part of Japan, as part of the co-prosperity sphere.
Japan is capable of huge changes of direction. One of those changes of direction was the Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s. And my understanding of how that unfurled was the Japanese looked around and they realized the power disparity between the Western countries and Japan and Asia. And so they sent out fact finders to Europe and to America and gathered as much information as they possibly could about why the disparity existed. And they realized that the industrialized nations were far, far more capable of being powerful and projecting power around the world. And they also concluded that in order to build the strength of the nation, they needed to acquire colonies like the Western countries had done, with the possible exception of the United States, though we had a lot of influence in Latin America. And so that was the kind of thinking that drove the early development of the co-prosperity sphere and why they were reaching out to colonize and went into Manchuria and then Southeast Asia. And I wonder if you thought that made sense, that was part of the inspiration for the attack on Hawaii.
They felt that Hawaii was just an extension of Japan. Even the leaders of the revolution that deposed the Queen in 1893, they feared Japan. They were afraid that Japan had their sights on. In fact, Japan, after it opened up to the world and it started to modernize and it started to build a modern navy, and they even had a British Navy, British shipbuilders build probably the most powerful cruiser in the world was a Japanese one, and Japan in the late 1890s sent that cruiser to Hawaii, trying to stop the United States from annexing um, Hawaii in the late 1890s. And actually, the effort backfired because the annexation resolution was stalled in the Senate and it wasn't coming out. But when Japan was flexing its muscle and under on the heels of the Sino-Japan battles, the Congress realized, hey, we've got to do something here, and so it hastened the Senate passing the annexation resolution, which Japan was just bitterly against.
You mentioned that they war gamed to the attack on Pearl Harbor in, I guess, September of 41. What was the result? Did that war game include the occupation of the islands?
No, it was just a war game, but they were still talking about whether to invade. Of course, we did our own war games. There were the major fleet problems. There was one in 1925. There was another one in 1932 and 1933, and another one later in 1938. These war games actually war gamed a foreign nation, which was Japan. I mean, that Japan would attack Hawaii and potentially invade Hawaii. And all of these war games, all the ones I just mentioned, showed that it was feasible for Japan to attack Oahu, invade and occupy, and successfully attack Pearl Harbor and attack Oahu. And Japan was using the results of our war games in their own plans for Pearl Harbor. In other words, we proved to ourselves that Hawaii was vulnerable, but didn't do anything to significantly protect us from the attack. And the 1932 attack came from the Northwest, just like the attack on Pearl Harbor. And we just dismissed that at the time of Pearl Harbor. We couldn't fathom that they would come up from the Northwest, which was a more difficult transit. They thought if there was going to be attack, it was from the Southwest, and so we were searching the Southwest, not in the Northwest. So we weren't even taking ownership of our own conclusions. And the person who attacked Pearl Harbor in 1932 was Captain Ernest King on the carrier Lexington. And he became the head of the military of the Navy during World War II. And the Army people defending Oahu cried foul because he attacked on a Sunday morning. They said it's not legal to attack somebody on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, violation of international law.
So, Mike, you've both said that this was the greatest blunder of World War II and maybe in military history or in history. But if Yamamoto's idea about occupying Hawaii had also come to fruition, and the Japanese did both, attacked Pearl Harbor and occupied Hawaii, wouldn't that have been all the greater of a blunder? I mean, if it was waking the sleeping industrial giant of the United States to attack Pearl Harbor, wouldn't it have been all the more a blunder to take both courses at the same time?
The reason that they chose not to invade and occupy on the heels of the attack was that the Army did not feel that they could do what they needed to do in Southwest Asia and occupy Hawaii, that they didn't have enough people to be able to manage both. So that that is the reason why the Army was against it, and why the main reason we didn't invade. Although they changed their mind in May of '42, and they were making plans to invade on the heels of Midway. But that being said, had they invaded, we would have had no fleet. We wouldn't have the Pearl Harbor shipyard and the fuel supplies. We wouldn't have been able to refloat almost every, with a few exceptions. We refloated almost everybody that got sunk in Pearl Harbor in those shipyards. We would have been left with just the three carriers, and so our entire defense of the Pacific would have been thrown back to the west coast of the United States. And imagine, could there have been a Guadalcanal? Could there have been an attack on Tokyo? It would have been an enormous task for us to be able to get. We would have to get Hawaii back before we could do any of the offensive actions that in the Western Pacific that Nimitz championed all through the 42, 43, and 44. So I think it'd have been extremely problematic for us to get back Oahu had they invaded.
What does it take, Shackley, to invade and occupy? It's kind of like regime change. It's kind of like the issues we face in Iran. You're going to put boots on the ground. You're going to put boots on every county, every island in the Hawaiian chain. That's a lot of work. That requires a lot of people and ships and materiel and so forth. And I don't know how much resistance they would have met. And I realized they ultimately gave up any possibility of that plan in 1943. But if you were Yamamoto and arguing for this, what kind of plan would you ask for? Apparently, it's not so easy to make a plan to invade and occupy.
I think that's a big question. He would have probably had to double his fleet because he'd had to have a lot of soldiers coming along who could land on Oahu against opposition and take over Oahu to start with. Whether he could take all the other islands as well is another question. Maybe it would be that we controlled the other islands and they only controlled the island of Oahu, concentrating in Pearl Harbor. I mean, there's a lot of different scenarios as how it could work, but just the logistics of landing boots on the ground, as we say, from Japan and somehow making that work seems, we talk about how difficult it might be for the Chinese to invade Taiwan. I mean, this would have been an enormous challenge for an invading force to successfully carry out and then to somehow supply it, especially since we would immediately launch lots of ships and submarines in particular from the West Coast to isolate it from shipping from Japan. I don't know. I'd be interested to know what Mike thinks about that.
Anthony P. Tully and Jonathan Parshall, who are the authors of Shattered Sword about Midway, they concluded on this issue, quote, "The Japanese simply did not possess the amphibious and logistical wherewithal to assault, capture, and hold the Hawaiian Islands. But," they said, "if Japan had immediately followed up the Pearl Harbor attack by invasion, then, quote, it is unlikely that the U.S. Army garrison would have been able to put up a cohesive defense. So the Japanese could conceivably have taken over the Hawaiian Islands." What they intended to do on the heels of Midway, once they secured Midway, they were going to take over Johnson Island and Palmyra Island, and from there they were going to launch an assault on the Big Island of Hawaii. And once they had the Big Island, then they could control Maui, and once they had Maui, then they would be able to attack and eventually occupy Oahu. That was the plan, but of course, the loss at Midway, that went by the wayside.
Midway was part of the plan, wasn't it?
Midway was the opening gambit of of what Yamamoto wanted to do was to invade Hawaii, but it was going to be several steps. So Midway was first, and then in the fall, they would take over Johnson and Palmyra, and then they'd be able to squeeze in and eventually take over Oahu.
That's a huge chunk to bite off to capture the Big Island and all of Maui, and then attack Oahu. I don't know.
Hawaii and Maui wouldn't have been that hard to take. All of the firepower was on Oahu, but the Army had bought into that in May of 42. They resisted it all the way up to May of 40. In fact, just before the Army caved and said, okay, we'll support it, Yamamoto had decided that Midway was just going to be a standalone. They were going to take Midway, and that would help neutralize the Pacific Fleet. They would be able to fly around and bomb the Pacific Fleet. But right within 2 weeks of Midway, the Army changed. Says, okay, we'll support the invasion.
Other than trying to acquire colonies, what was the reason for Japan attacking America in the first place?
This was Yamamoto's idea. If you're going to attack, if we're going to go to war, and we're going to have to attack the Pacific Fleet, and the idea was to knock us on our back feet, and we would be neutralized for 6 months to maybe up to a year and a half or 2 years. That was the idea, but it's absolutely stupid.
Why do it in the first place? There was no more Holland. Germany had taken over all of Europe, so they were acquiring colonies in Asia that didn't have links anymore with their other colonizers, and that included a lot of oil down in the Dutch East Indies. What was the point of attacking America?
Remember, they wanted to go to Southeast Asia to get the minerals and the oil supplies down there in order to fuel their war effort, and in the way was the Philippines. So they needed to neutralize the Philippines as well. So if you're going to neutralize the Philippines, you're going to have to neutralize the Pacific Fleet. I'm not advocating that was a good idea. I think it was a stupid idea. It was a big imagine if they hadn't attacked us. We were still isolationists. How are we going to go to war against Japan if they didn't attack us? That got us into the war. It got us into a war against Japan, and then 2 days later, we were in a war with Germany.
Assume that they had attacked the Philippines for the reason you mentioned. Would we have gone to war over that?
Probably. I think we probably would have.
MacArthur was down there, so he was influential.
We had a lot of soldiers there, and a lot of. We had the Asiatic Fleet there. We had submarines, PT boats, soldiers. We had a huge presence in the Philippines. We had Clark Air Force Base with all of their planes. So, and they needed to transit up and down between Southwest Asia and the Pacific to Japan, going by the Philippines. So they in their minds they needed to neutralize the Philippines.
And while this was all being planned, while Pearl Harbor was being planned and about to be executed with the attack, there were Japanese diplomats in Washington who were ostensibly negotiating something with the FDR's government. And I wonder whether that kind of deception, it was a deception, was part of the reason that this attack awoke the sleeping giant. In other words, we felt that was very unfair, that on the one hand, they were negotiating, and on the other hand, they were attacking. Very tricky business. Your thoughts?
Everyone who were students of Japan knew that they would attack without a declaration of war, that they would do a sneak attack. And we knew that. We knew historically that's how they operated. And there were a number of reports bubbling up through various sources around the world that Japan was planning a sneak attack. So it shouldn't become as a surprise that they would do something sneaky at that time, and that they were stringing us along in those communications, those diplomatic communications. And they claimed that the last communication they were we were they claimed that they wanted us to know that we're cutting off diplomatic relationships before the attack happened, and apparently the timing was off. And so some people were upset that they had done this in such a sneaky way, but no one should have been surprised.
If they had not attacked the Philippines and Pearl Harbor, they probably could have enjoyed a much longer period of taking advantage of Southeast Asia and China and those other potential colonies of theirs before we would have done anything assertively.
Yeah, and we wouldn't have been in war with Germany.
Yeah, that's right.
This was a huge blunder on many levels. It was a mistake in the decision process. And I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about what this informs us about Japan's decision process in those years. Was there a cultural element there that led them down the wrong path on so many issues? Why did they make mistakes as profound as these?
I think it kind of goes back to the Russo-Japanese War. They had emerged as a westernized industrial nation, and they'd been pretty successful up to that point, colonizing most of Manchuria and other parts of China and Southeast Asia. They defeated the biggest country in the world, Russia, the Russian Empire, their fleet pretty soundly. And so they were probably fairly confident that they were, up to the challenge. I don't know. What do you think, Mike?
I remember Yamamoto was the one that really understood America because he'd spent time here. And he warned Japan against going to war with the United States. He said, "Don't do it." And I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding by the leadership who did not understand America. I think this underestimated the strength and resolve and resilience of America. Many of them thought that after Pearl Harbor, that the United States would sue for peace. That many of the military thinkers were thinking that the U.S. would just simply agree to a peaceful resolution of the conflict, but it was irrevocable after that attack. It completely dissolved the America First isolationist people like Lindbergh that was trying to keep us out of any wars, and it galvanized the United States. The United States, a year before Pearl Harbor, was largely isolationist. The public did not want another land war in Europe. They didn't want to go to war again. But right after Pearl Harbor, it turned around on a dime. And the public supported the war effort.
It informs us as to how you start a war, how you organize for it, how you execute your plan to attack and all that. So, Mike, if I made you Yamamoto just for a moment, how would you have done it different and better?
I would not have gone to war with the United States, period. That was his recommendations. No, do not go to war. He said, if you do go to war, then if we're going to war, I got to get rid of the Pacific Fleet. This is at a time when, battleships were still considered the frontline naval force. The carrier was being developed, and we had carriers and they had carriers, but the mindset of the Navy was battleships. And what we didn't know was they had virtually become obsolete, and Pearl Harbor proved that. Basically, they were useful throughout the war, but the carrier had supplanted the carrier in the mainstream Navy minds. Battleship was still supreme, but so Yamamoto, he said, let's just destroy the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, and that gives me the breathing room. And they hoped that there'd be carriers there. 11 days before Pearl Harbor, there was a carrier in port. But can you imagine? All three Pacific carriers were out of Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack. We are so fortunate that that happened, because that was part of the reason why the Nagumo was the head of the force that attacked Pearl Harbor. He called off the last sortie that was going to attack Pearl Harbor, that was going to go after our oil supplies, our submarine base, and our dry docks. And so I always say that that was a second strategic blunder on top of Pearl Harbor, that now we had in Pearl Harbor, we had all the fuel supplies, we had a shipyard, we had dry docks, we could repair ships, we could fuel ships, and which we did. And that was another strategic blunder.
Shackley, you're an historian or a student of history, if you will, and so are you, Mike. And I want to ask you, Pearl Harbor stands 10 feet tall in military events, for sure, a day of infamy that changed the world forever. And my question to you, Shackley, and to you, Mike, too, is, how does it inform us today? I mean, the attack on Iran was likewise a kind of sneak attack. It runs a parallel to what the Japanese did on December 7th. How does it inform the art of war, the conduct of war going forward?
I think if Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor or the Philippines, they would have consolidated their power in Asia and in China. And think about one of the reasons that Stalin was able to successfully attack at Stalingrad was he was able to bring troops in, and in Moscow, he was able to bring troops in from the Far East because he'd reached an accommodation with Japan, and Japan was overstretched at that point in dealing with the Americans. Had that not been the case, then fighting power may not have been available to the Russians, and the whole balance of power in the East, the Eastern effort of the Germans may have turned out differently as well. So it's pretty significant event.
It just shows you the monumental stupidity of the entrenched Army High Command, which is basically controlled the government of Japan in insisting that we go to war, that Japan go to war with the United States, that they just could not fathom doing anything without going to war. And that's why they insisted on Yamamoto being the architect. But every decision they made there was absolutely stupid and phenomenally destructive of their own efforts. So I agree with Shackley that if they had never attacked, it would have been very hard for us to go to war against Japan. We tend not to go to war unless someone attacks us first. We don't initiate wars. We go to war when we're being attacked in various ways. If there are significant threats or someone actually attacks us. Can you imagine a circumstance if Japan had just gone down into southwestern Pacific, into Asia to get their supplies that they needed? The circumstance under which we would go to war with Japan when they never attacked us, didn't attack us in the Philippines. I think Roosevelt would have been hard-pressed to justify us going to war.
Could we say that the Japanese plans then were good tactically and operationally, but not strategically?
Yamamoto achieved 100% of what the goal of Pearl Harbor was. That was to destroy the Pacific Fleet. That's all he wanted to do. And he achieved that just brilliantly. Imagine, we thought that there's no way that a torpedo could operate, be dropped from the air in something as shallow as Pearl Harbor. Well, they developed a torpedo that operated in shallow water. We didn't put up any barrage balloons. We parked all the planes together so that they were beautiful targets. We locked away their ammunition. Uh, General Short, who was the head of the army in charge, his job was to have an air force that would protect the ships of Pearl Harbor, but he was fixated on sabotage. He thought that all the 160,000 Japanese ethnic Japanese in Hawaii would subject them to sabotage. So all of his thinking was to protect his planes and his ammunition from sabotage, but that wasn't his job. His job was to protect the Pacific Fleet, and he completely blew that.
This leads to the question of whether, well, the U.S. was lucky in many ways, those three carriers out at sea and so forth. But what does it teach us in terms of having a defensive posture that works, that protects the country, both politically, first America first, and being more well prepared in case of an attack that everybody knew was going to happen at some point. So what did we learn then that applies after that time now?
That when you do a war game and it proves that your enemy has the ability to achieve an objective that you want to stop, that you take a lesson from that and make sure that you have the defensive ability to defend against those attacks. And we completely blew it. Everything we learned in the war games in the 20s and 30s that Japan used to attack Pearl Harbor, we didn't learn from that, even though Hawaii had become what I think General Marshall called it the citadel of the Pacific. The military thinking was that Hawaii was so ringed with defenses. We had cannons, we had air bases, we've got Hickam, Wheeler Field, Bellows, Kaneohe Naval Air Station, Schofield Barracks. We had massive defenses there to defend against any attack by Pearl Harbor, by Japan, but we didn't use it to prevent an attack by Japanese. We didn't use the things that we developed for the very purpose of defending against Japan attacking Pearl Harbor. It was as if we were defenseless.
Okay, we're at a time where we ought to talk about final summary comments. So, Shackley, would you go first? What are your thoughts that you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Well, I think it all comes back down to being prepared, right? And to, as Mike says, wargaming and paying attention to the results of the war games and making sure that you're technologically a step ahead of the torpedoes that they can drop in Pearl Harbor that we didn't know about or we thought weren't possible. You always have to be cautious and alert to the fact that the others may be moving ahead of you, and that could be fatal. And so you can never rest. I think that history tells us that war is a sort of natural state of things, and peace is really the absence of war. Kissinger said that, and it's really a matter of sovereign powers competing for their own interests. And the way we protect ourselves against being taken advantage of is being far superior so that nobody takes us on.
Wow, yes, certainly. Mike, your thoughts that you would like to leave with listeners?
I don't know how you can, people get lulled by their own stupidity. And I don't know how you guard against not taking actions that war games that you're conducting prove that you have to do X, Y, and Z, but you don't. I don't know how you avoid that, but I think we've got to take lessons from those war games. And I've been in war games, and they're extremely valuable. They're important, but if we don't learn from them, then it's as if we didn't do it, and we just completely ignored the lessons learned. Can you imagine? We didn't learn the lessons learned from our own war games, but Japan did. Japan used our war games, and in fact, several books on that came out, both novels and also military studies in Japan in the 20s and 30s, that showed the feasibility of attacking and taking over Hawaii. We were blind to it, and yet they got the lessons from us, and that's why we lost Pearl Harbor. Is because we didn't learn the lessons, but the Japan did.
Shackley, you want to do rebuttal?
No. It's a funny thing, though, that a funny mindset that, as Mike says, they can do a serious war game, get the results, and then ignore them, right? Even these high-ranking professionals, they just ignore it. They can't convince the civilian authorities that we really need to do this because our security depends upon it. It's just a kind of a human mindset that just doesn't want to address risk, I guess.
Well, those issues still exist today.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, thank you very much. Thanks so much to our guest, Michael Lilly, Captain U.S. Navy retired, former Attorney General of the state of Hawaii. And thank you to Shackley Raffetto, also retired captain in the U.S. Navy and the retired chief judge of the Second Circuit of Hawaii. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Keeping Track of a Rapidly Changing World. And this episode has been about Japan's doomed plans to invade and occupy Hawaii, things that most people don't know about. Thank you for enlightening us, gentlemen. And thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, Shackley. Aloha, Mike.
Aloha.
Aloha.